Hey there, folks. I'm a literal goblin, and if there's one thing I love, it is dumpster fires. One dumpster fire that has caught my eye as of recently has been the announcement of Assassin's Creed Shadows. I mean, ooh baby. There's been quite a war over it due to the choice of using Yasuke as one of the protagonists. There are dozens of takes by those terminally online either about the historical accuracy or the respect that Ubisoft has for the culture. The issue is that, as a trained historian myself, plenty of these takes are like a slap of pure stupidity to the face. Alongside that, Yasuke's controversy also coincidentally hides the real issues at play, which has to do with Ubisoft's own greed and business practices. So today I felt like using my background in history to help set the record straight by analyzing the 5 primary documents we actually have on Yasuke. Yes, despite what Ubisoft may say in interviews about how Yasuke kept surfacing in their historical research, there's actually very little information about the man. Now, some may argue that I'm not a historian of the Sengoku period specifically, and if so, I shouldn't really be talking about the subject. Well, I really hate to break it to you, pal, but the one consultant Ubisoft has shown is a professor of Japanese literature and culture who doesn't actually teach any history classes. In fact, their first book was on romantic relationships between Buddhist priests and adolescent boys, which supposedly challenges a host of normative and normal standards that people generally have. These standards include things like transgenerational sex, which God help us if that means what I think it means. So, as someone who has written about Japanese women during World War II, I feel that we are evenly matched in our capabilities to analyze Yasuke as a historical figure. During my analysis, I'm going to go ahead and use my Rembrandt-level MS Paint skills to make a little graph of the things we do know and the things that we don't know but may have been. And at the end, we'll take a look and see what we really know about Yasuke. So, who was Yasuke? Well, Yasuke was an African man brought to Japan by Jesuits in 1579. He's mentioned in a handful of documents, some of which have to be gauged with a little bit more scrutiny than others. The most trustworthy one is from a chronicle that was recorded about Nobunaga by one of his vassals, one of his homeboys. It was put together using the notes and diaries kept by his vassal, and it's hard to pinpoint any secondary bias that may be at play into it. Nothing like, oh, I hate, Yasuke or whatever have you, or any reason for him to want to undercut or to talk up Yasuke. So it's fairly unbiased. Well, these are probably just a bunch of rolled up papers or such. I like to think of this feudal Japanese vassal with like his feet kicking up in the air while he's writing in a little pink journal, and he's sitting there writing, "Dear diary, that bastard Karata said my nose rivals that of one of the foreigners. I wish I could boil him alive. But alas, we are equals." From this work, it notes Yasuke's physique and his health, stating that he had the strength of 10 men. He was also given a home and stipend, and is recorded as carrying Nobunaga's tools sometimes. Now, it should be noted that when they say tools, they probably mean weapons. One other Japanese source also gave Yasuke's height, which was about 6 feet tall. In modern Japan, the average size of a male is about 5'7". Seeing as how Yasuke was coming in after about 100 years of civil war, we can probably put the average height of a average Japanese male during this period to be around 5'6", simply due to the fact of instability and perhaps hunger, that sort of thing. Now, what exactly does this mean? Well, it does mean that we can confidently confirm that Yasuke was an absolute unit. Throw that shit up and confirmed, bucko. We got a confirmation. Big guy, big man. However, what we can't confirm is his actual role in relation to Nobunaga. While one may point to the fact that he was given a short sword as proof of him being a warrior or bodyguard, it is important to note that the swords were often given to people who weren't warriors in many cultures, including Japan. At the same time, this does not disqualify him from ever receiving combat training or existing as a bodyguard. After all, if Yasuke was helping him carry his weapons around, he was also a big enough man to protect Nobunaga in areas outside of the battlefield. The only definite conflict we know Yasuke was a part of was the Honnoji incident, which was when Nobunaga was betrayed by his vassal, Akechi. When this occurred, Yasuke went to defend Nobunaga's son named Nobutada. You can imagine the trouble that even your average samurai may have had when they're trying to enter the grounds Nobutada was staying on, and they are met by Nobutada's retainer, as well as the giant Yasuke. It's also useful to think about the requirements to be a guard rather than a soldier in the 16th century. The requirements are more about size, physique, with some martial training, as well as the ability to know what to do in a small-scale fight. When we say small-scale fights, they can range anywhere from like a small skirmish to just a few guys. Think anywhere between 1 versus 1 all the way up to 30 versus 30. That's still small scale for a bodyguard. Now, a soldier during the period has a few different requirements in training, such as how to organize in formations, communicate orders, and how to fight effectively in the mass infantry tactics that were common during this period. This means a lord's retinue had to be fluid as well. When not expecting to go into a battle, a lord would likely surround himself with the most loyal, strong, and skilled men he knew. On the other hand, if he was headed into a battlefield where he would have to command an army, he would probably have to refine his retinue. Since a general would have to be able to move around quickly on the battlefield and give orders to men, he was oftentimes on horseback, which means that the men in his retinue would also have to be very good horses. I mean, wait, no, not horses. They'd have to be good at horsemanship, not that. Sorry, let me just get my bearings. Alongside that, these soldiers would also have to be skilled at navigating the battlefield as well, and also need to know what they should do if they were ever separated from the general. It's very easy during this period for that kind of thing to happen. For context on the size of battles that you would see during the Sengoku period, supposedly the army that was brought in to betray Nobunaga was about 13,000 men strong. I believe this is the reason why we don't see any documentation about Yasuke being in a battlefield with Nobunaga or such things as that, because he was meant to be more of a bodyguard in times in which Nobunaga was not thinking he was going to be like leading an army, right? It also helps to play into this, battlefields can get really dangerous compared to just guarding the Lord. And as we'll see in later sources, I do believe that Nobunaga really liked Yasuke. And he was not going to introduce or bring Yasuke onto a battlefield until he was properly trained and completely ready to do that. If Nobunaga was not betrayed and he could keep spending time with Yasuke, right? I believe that he would have 100% had prepared him and basically elevated him from being just, bodyguard up to maybe general's bodyguard. Jumping over from that, we can also tell from the Japanese sources one important thing, and this is something I've seen some people mention. Simply put, Yasuke was not a slave for Nobunaga. When he served under Nobunaga, he received a stipend. He was given a home on castle grounds. With that, now it's time to get into some of the other documents, ones that require a little bit more of critical analysis. These are the Jesuit letters and reports pertaining to Yasuke within Japan. First, let's make it clear. The Jesuits do have cause to talk up the accomplishments of Yasuke in Japan within their reports to the church. As he was brought to Nobunaga by the Jesuits, Yasuke's successes, in a way, was their successes. And these successes could be reported back up to the church. In the Jesuit documents, one major thing they like to portray is the close connection that Yasuke and Nobunaga had. The Jesuit documents state that Nobunaga and Yasuke loved talking with one another. And I believe that. Take a moment and ask yourself, if you were Nobunaga, who would you want to be talking to? You just got back from having to work on, let's say, rewriting certain laws, taking complaints from some idiot peasant about rice production this year, and all the servants in the household are talking about the courtly intrigue happening with some advisors of yours. There's only one guy in the entirety of your court who is an outsider, who has no connections whatsoever to any other lord, who has a worldly insight. He's traveled around the world, right? He's been to India, he's been to Africa, and now he's in Japan. And in general, he's incredibly loyal to you. On top of that, he probably shares certain interests you do. One of your favorite things is doing little contests of strength and showing off. And this guy is incredibly strong. It makes sense that he'd be a close confidant of Nobunaga. However, in the very same sources, the Jesuits also reported that there was talk amongst locals that Nobunaga was thinking about making Yasuke a Tono. Now, Tono can mean a lot of different things. It does not inherently imply a noble status, but it does mean a high enough status where it's you're possibly commanding people. It basically means lord or master. From what I've read so far, yes, it could mean a lord of a castle, but at the same time, it could mean a captain of a guard or a leader of warriors. Should also go without saying that this source is a third-hand account. It's the Jesuits are writing a letter, and it's about a rumor they heard from commoners in town that supposedly Yasuke is going to be made into a lord. Something we don't get even a hint of in the Japanese sources. Another aspect I've seen talked up in these sources is that Nobunaga gave Yasuke an attendant whenever he roamed around the city of Kyoto. However, it should be noted that this does not inherently mean that man was like a servant under Yasuke. Instead, if you take into account how long Yasuke has been in the service of Nobunaga for, he's only been in service to Nobunaga for 6 months. And that means the attendant, in my mind, was probably there for about 3 things. The first one may have been simply to aid in navigation of areas in and around Kyoto. The second reason is, of course, to help out with any mistranslation that occurs. And finally, the last reason was probably to smooth over any misunderstandings that could have arisen. You have to remember where Yasuke has spent the majority of his time in Japan. He spent the majority of his time either around Jesuits, and now the rest of his time has been spent around these higher kind of caste people up in the castle. The chance of some misunderstanding, whether due to custom or mistaken dialect with like common folk, was likely a problem. Here's a little interesting comparison. Think about if you took a Japanese man and you brought him over to medieval England, and the majority of his time learning English and learning the English kind of customs was in the king's castle. When he starts having to deal with the local villagers or local townsfolk who are basically commoners, there's probably still going to be a lot of issues with communication and misunderstandings that could occur, so a attendant would be very nice. If he was a bit further into his service than 6 months, I would probably argue that, no, there's a likelihood it was a servant. But right now I'm leaning more towards the idea that it was somebody assigned by Nobunaga to look out for Yasuke whenever he went down into town, just in case. Now there is one more source I would like to cover, but it doesn't have to do with any of the direct Jesuit letters or primary sourcing on Yasuke from the period. Rather, it's a letter written by another Jesuit about 10 years later, and it can help shed some light into what exactly his background was before he entered service with Nobunaga. Pulling this letter from an anthology of letters known as They Came to Japan, an anthology of European reports on Japan 1543 to 1640, in it you can find a Portuguese Jesuit immediately assuming that Yasuke was a slave. In it, it states, Froy, writing on April 14th, 1581, relates how the inquisitive populace of Miyako broke down the door to the Jesuit residence in the eagerness to inspect a black slave. This lines up with a Jesuit letter about Yasuke, recounting the same exact instance. With this, while we don't know exactly what his background was before he came to Japan, it seems that other Jesuits immediately assumed that he was a slave from the report. The last Jesuit report is about his final moments in Japan, which was during the Hinnoji incident. Basically, when Nobunaga was being ambushed in the Hinnoji temple, Yasuke was reported as fighting outside the residence of Nobutada, which was Nobunaga's son. It should be noted that the Jesuits in the letter specifically state he was out there fighting for quite a long time. That is until a vassal of the traitor Akechi arrived and asked him to put down his weapon, basically convinced him to surrender. When he did so, they did not kill Yasuke. Instead, they handed him back to the Jesuits. After that, Yasuke disappears from the historical record. Alright, so let's take a look at the graph and see what exactly is true and what is unconfirmed about Yasuke. First and foremost, absolute unit. We've confirmed that pretty well from the Japanese sources. Second, he was not a slave for Nobunaga. Third, he was definitely one of Nobunaga's confidants. And fourth, he fought to defend Nobunaga's son after Nobunaga was to betray. And he was probably quite effective during that point. What is unconfirmed about Yasuke is his actual role. From my point of view, it seems to be that he was a type of guard, but not one that would accompany the general out onto the field, rather somebody who would be with him during his travels or any point where he was not expecting to get into a big battle. Now, I do believe that Yasuke was being prepared to be a general's guard, but he had only had 2 years of experience up to the point of the Hinnoji incident. And on that topic of the Hinnoji incident, we don't really know of any battles he partook in past that one, but it is possible, just unlikely, that he could have been involved in another battle. The last thing we are unable to confirm is what was Yasuke's background before entering Nobunaga's service. And it's still up in the air. I lean a little bit more towards a slave, but there's also some ideas that he was also a bodyguard for the Jesuits. So how does Ubisoft's portrayal of Yasuke play into all of this? Simply put, it's likely to expand him well outside of the role he actually filled as a bodyguard for Nobunaga, with him instead filling the role of a battlefield warrior. It's not inherently bad, however the issue arises when you start to ask why they chose Yasuke and compare him to past assassins. Let's stop and take a moment to look at past Assassin's Creed protagonists, as that will give us a little bit of a hint as to why they chose Yasuke. Altair from the first Assassin's Creed, fictional. Ezio Auditore, fictional. Connor, Atham, and Edward Kenway, fictional. Bayek of Siwa, fictional. Alexios, fictional, but we'll put a little parentheses here. He was based on a real person, but he wasn't actually that historical figure. Who else is there? Oh, Eivor Vernsdottir, fictional. And Basim, fictional. Now, I know I may have missed some entries simply due to the amount of games in the series, but it should be obvious that the main characters in Assassin's Creed games have been fictional ones. Yet, Assassin's Creed Shadow's protagonists are both real people, which means that Ubisoft has made the conscious choice to change their narrative formula. If you know Ubisoft, they are nothing if not formulaic with their games. If I were to say Ubisoft game, an image appears in my head of a massive open world game with stealth mechanics, skill tree, and one or two gimmicks that make the game unique from the rest of the Ubisoft catalog. It goes without saying, but when an adjective in the games media sphere is Ubisofty to describe certain types of games, you're kind of formulaic. Ubisoft does at times change things slightly by adding in a gimmick that was in one game to a lot of their other titles, just as the drone from the Ghost Recon series finding its way into plenty others such as Basim's Hawk in the Assassin's Creed series. There is an underlying question we still have to ask, which is why does Ubisoft change their formulas? And let's be blunt, Ubisoft loves money. Let's use the example of Assassin's Creed Odyssey. Assassin's Creed Odyssey made a massive shift from the original Assassin's Creeds into turning itself into more of an ARPG, with RPG loot, levels, health bars, all of that stuff. This was a massive change for the Assassin's Creed formula. Of course, this change in the formula was also accompanied by the sudden introduction of a cash shop into a single-player game. The game ended up garnering controversy because when it released a mission builder, a lot of people used the mission builder to make XP grind missions that were easy to complete and gave you a lot of XP because of how slow the progression was in the game. Now, Ubisoft made the decision to ban these missions that were user-created, meant to gain a lot of XP and help people progress faster, incidentally while having XP boosters in the shop. Another example of a massive formula change caused by greed is Ghost Recon Breakpoint. The series was a hardcore tactical shooter. Ghost Recon Breakpoint was advertised as that. They advertised it as a hardcore military shooter where players were fighting an insurmountable enemy. The player would slip down slopes while running, break bones, and get grisly wounds. They'd have to take time to heal and use wits and tactics to survive an enemy that was much more well equipped than them. The trailers showed all of this in a super serious light. However, what was delivered was instead a looter shooter, with arbitrary stuff like gear score, RPG mechanics, and it even lacked AI squad mates the past game had. This is significant because the AI had something called Sync Shot tied to their mechanics. Sync Shot allowed you and your squad to take down multiple enemies at the same time. But since it lacked AI squad mates, the new one required you use a item, a consumable, to pull off a Sync Shot. This consumable could be found or crafted via resources gathered in the world, but also, coincidentally, there's plenty of resource packs for sale on the in-game shop. Once more, this all ties back to a cash shop. Instead of grinding through the game to get experience, weapons, weapon attachments, and some cosmetics, it once again offers a shortcut by paying money. On top of that, the hub area you enter into loads in players who are not part of your squad, thus exposing you to premium cosmetics the shop has to offer. In total, the total cost of just the cash-only cosmetics is around $350. That's enough to purchase the game 6 times over. To be honest, Ghost Recon Breakpoint was my breaking point for Ubisoft. It just proved to me that they're more in it for the money than making good games. So what does this have to do with the sudden breaking of formula by adding historical figures like Yasuke and Naui into the new Assassin's Creed game? Well, it comes at the same time Ubisoft is rolling out an even more unethical monetization plan for the game's release. If people are debating about Yasuke's inclusion in the game, they aren't talking about the absolute Mr. Krabs level of nickel and diming Ubisoft is doing. Simply taking a look at what's on the purchasing guide table, if you do not pay $110, you are missing out on 2 missions that are releasing on launch, aka cut content. On top of that, you'll be playing the game 3 days later than everyone else. This isn't some kind of beta either. It doesn't stress test servers, it's not there for bug fixes, it's not there to test anything. It's simply a way to charge more via punishing those who don't pay a premium price. It's also important to remember the words, all publicity is good publicity. When you start to take into account all of the different flops that Ubisoft has had over the past few years, such as Watch Dogs Legion, Ghost Recon Breakpoint, and Assassin's Creed Mirage, it makes sense that they're trying to garner as much attention to this game as possible, and controversy is one of the ways to do that. I tried explaining this issue to someone who wasn't too familiar with games at one point. Ubisoft is a baker. You enter into his bakery and prepare to buy a loaf of bread. He tells you that due to the scale and quality of his bread, he has to increase the price from $60 up to $70. And you shrug it off. Inflation and quality costs might actually have done that. You then pay him the $70 for the loaf of bread. He tells you that you cannot have your bread right now and have to come back in 3 days. This is despite the loaves of bread stacked up behind him and him handing other customers their loaves of bread. When asked about this, the baker just turns around and says, "Oh, well, they paid extra to have their bread when it's freshly baked, unlike you." Whatever, you say to yourself. You go back to the baker 3 days later to go pick up your bread. When the baker hands you your loaf of bread, it is missing 2 slices from the loaf. Those were the premium slices that were cut out due to you not paying the extra money. Looking over to see if anybody else is pissed off by this, you see that people are instead arguing about the political sign the baker has put up to attract attention. People who side with the political message think that those that are criticizing the baker are against said political message. That's how much of the Assassin's Creed Shadows discussion feels to me. Finally, there is the story writing of the game. As of right now, we don't know what exactly they're going to do with the story. However, there are some interesting things about Yasuke confronting the demons of his past and Naoi on a quest of revenge listed in the website. The issue I have right now with the story is that I don't think they are going to do Yasuke's special situation justice, and instead are just going to have him fill in the role of like a stereotypical battlefield samurai. Examining the characters from the past Assassin's Creed games, they've almost always been a representative of some kind of group from the region it takes place in. As such, I feel that they will try to emphasize that Yasuke is a representative of the average samurai. However, this is the route they go. I disagree with this. Yasuke should really represent an outsider to Japan, albeit a respected one that has proved himself. He could even be the guy who has ties to the assassins. If they wrote the game with only Naoi, most people wouldn't be upset by it. After all, we have had female assassins in the past, such as Assassin's Creed Liberation. Much in the same way, if they were to add a third character that is a representative of the average samurai during the period, and had Yasuke shown as a unique outsider, no one would have had an issue with this. Some might argue that more than 2 protagonists is way too ambitious. All I have to say to that is that I've seen plenty of games pull off multiple protagonists in their stories well. If Ubisoft decides to not fill the world with mindless side activities and collectibles and actually take a risk, then perhaps we could get something truly spectacular. Imagine for a moment 3 characters with the archetypes of a shinobi, a ronin, and a giant. Naoi, the shinobi, has to focus on stealth due to low combat skill and has access to very fast climbing and movement tech to easily get away. A assassin who really leans into the word assassin. She's calculating and has a sharp wit as a character and runs into the other 2 during her quest for revenge. The ronin, a lordless samurai, is a mixture of assassin and warrior. He's still able to run around and get up on rooftops, but also able to hold his own in a fight much better than the shinobi. He wields normal katanas and such, with a single hidden blade as well. His whole demeanor could be that guy just trying to keep his head down and enjoy life, but he keeps getting dragged into the conflict. In a way, he would be a jack of all trades, similar to Ezio. Finally, you could have Yasuke, the giant. Here, Ubisoft could get pretty inventive with his gameplay, as he might be barely able to climb. Instead, his whole way of escaping is actually using his strength. Plowing through walls or pushing things over to break contact with the enemy. And when he does get caught, well, He's probably the best fighter out of the bunch. He could wield the heaviest two-handed weapons. His whole personality, maybe, is the upbeat but dutiful guard to Nobunaga, and he is willing to go above and beyond in his duty to protect him. Just think about that. An interlocking story of three characters and their goals, in which one pushes the idea of being an assassin to its extreme, and the other is as far from an assassin as you can make him. However, such thinking is dangerous over at Ubisoft. You will fill in pointless tasks to grind. You will make a 90-hour game with only 12 hours of actual fun content. You will put a map showing collectibles in the cash shop, and you will like it. In all honesty, I doubt Ubisoft will ever stop making Ubislop with fed-in monetization practices. If you want to hurt Ubisoft for its monetization model, but still play the game, I suggest you go and buy a month of Ubisoft Plus Premium instead of the full price of the game. If only 100 people do that, and they immediately cancel the order once they're done with the game, that's a $5,200 loss for Ubisoft, and you still get everything they were offering as the most expensive option. In conclusion, Yasuke's inclusion in the game isn't the main issue, but rather something to distract from the game's monetization practices. I will say, I like Yasuke as a historical figure. The guy lived a crazy life, made his way to Japan, and then went, "Whoa, Nobunaga needs my help? Alright, Nobunaga, you can count on me, I'll be your top guy." If you want to hear a more favorable theory of who Yasuke might have been, I suggest you go watch Thomas Lockley's lunchtime lecture. I've linked it down below. While I simply focused on using the 5 immediate primary sources, he reaches further beyond those to try and argue Yasuke being a member of the military elite. While I partially disagree with some points Lockley makes, I also still respect his research and his sourcing. Alright, hold the phone. I gotta make one last addendum here. From the trailers so far released, as well as the Japanese reaction to it, Ubisoft has shown they don't really have much respect for either Yasuke or Japanese culture. Commenters have already voiced their frustration, noting that this is a form of cultural appropriation, as well as certain commenters criticizing Ubisoft's depiction of the common Japanese people as shabby and curtsying to every stranger in armor. For Yasuke, the trailer has already shown him in an odd light, with him immediately resorting to killing 7 people in a crowded street as soon as he arrives in a new town. One of these people was even thrown towards him by a superior, and Yasuke kills the man in the same brutal manner before he can even raise his sword.
You don't understand. Yasuke needs to brutally execute every person he defeats. Gamers love cinematic executions.
The reasoning for this quest is barely fleshed out in the first place, with the implication being that these men are corrupt and taxing the peasants more than they should. But again, as Japanese commenters pointed out, unnecessary violence is something a wise and respected samurai would not do. Already, Ubisoft's haphazard way of writing quests has put Yasuke in the opposite light of what they were trying to display him as. I may have to make a follow-up video to this, but every piece of released media about the game has painted a bleaker and bleaker picture about Ubisoft's respect for the historical setting, as well as Yasuke. I'm a literal goblin. Thanks for watching. Leave a comment with any suggestions or hit that like button. Catch you guys later.